Somewhere in rural Oklahoma, there is a small brick building, probably no bigger than a two-car garage, that used to hum. Inside it was a switch. Well, it was a machine of switches, really, and it connected phone calls. There was a bank of batteries there, too, and a frame with hundreds of wire pairs landing on it, each one running out to a house or a farm or a feed store somewhere in the surrounding country. Sometime last year, someone walked into that building and shut it off, and that was the first one. And if the people that shut that one off get their wish, there'll be many more that follows. That's where I want to start today, because it's the first physical evidence that this thing that has been talked about quietly for a few years now is not just a plan anymore. It's happening. And the pace at which it's happening changed dramatically on March 26, 2026, when the Federal Communications Commission held a vote that got almost no coverage outside the trade press. This video is about that vote and about the decisions made before the vote. I did a video on this previously, but since that video, a lot of information has come to light. People across the pond actually had reached out to me and got me looking in a different direction. So sit back while we untangle who that quiet group is that's behind the end of the landlines. And I'm not talking about the FCC, although that's where we're going to start first. The FCC order. The order was called the Network and Services Modernization Order. The docket numbers, if you want to look them up yourself, are WC 25-208 and 25-209. The Commission adopted them unanimously. This meant all three city commissioners, the two Republicans and the lone Democrat, all voted yes. And what it did, in plain terms, was remove the protections that used to stand between a phone company deciding to shut off copper service and actually doing it. There were two safeguards in the old system. The first was something called the Network Change Disclosure. Under Section 251 of the Telecommunications Act, if a phone company wanted to retire copper in a given area, it had to file a public notice with the FCC. That notice went into a docket. Competitors and state regulators had a formal window to object. If they objected, the commission had to deal with it. That process was to make sure that people, particularly those in rural America, weren't left without access to affordable phone service. That safeguard, for all intents and purposes, is gone. The March order claims to have eliminated the filing requirements by the phone companies. It also claims to have gotten rid of FCC's practice of issuing public notices for copper retirements and eliminated the objection process. And interconnecting carriers can raise concerns through what the Commission described as less formal processes. In reality, the FCC has enabled basically a rubber stamp for phone companies to shut down phone systems that have been the bedrock of American communications for decades. The second safeguard is the one that most directly affects whether you personally still have a traditional landline phone in 3 years. It's called grandfathering. Under Section 214 of the Communications Act, a phone company can't discontinue, reduce, or impair a service without the FCC's authorization. And for a long time, the Commission treated "we're going to stop selling this service to new customers" as an impairment. I mean, it is one, right? If you move into a house and you can't order the service that the previous owner had and that other people around you have, that service has been reduced for you. It's been impaired. So closing a service to new customers required its own application and its own filing and its own approval process. Again, checks and balances. The March order granted blanket authority to grandfather legacy voice service. If you want to get technical, don't worry, we'll explain it. This means data services below 25 by 3 megabits. So any service meeting that description can be taken out without any filing requirement. A carrier can now put your entire exchange onto a sunset by sending you a letter. Let's expound a bit on that 25 by 3 megabits and what that actually means. That was the FCC's official definition of broadband set way back in 2015 and was redefined in 2024. This means nearly all DSL, which is internet that comes over your telephone line, can be eliminated. And dial-up internet is within that bucket as well. Basically, it gives the phone companies the ability to phase out everything associated with a traditional phone line. The POTS system, plain old telephone system, Yeah, that's what it's really called. DSL and dial-up. And this will have a huge impact since this will mean the end of traditional fax machines and most alarm systems that rely on the phone network. And I'm sure you're probably rolling your eyes right now because you think fax machines are useless these days. But many professional services from doctors' offices to law firms use fax machines. Why? Because they're on a dedicated line that has been considered one of the most secure, since hacking usually requires someone to get actually direct access to the line. And also, having a direct line has robust legal protections for basically everyone. And that, of course, includes the phone line itself. This also includes fire alarm panels that report over phone lines, elevator emergency phones, burglar alarms, and older credit card terminals that smaller businesses still rely on. All these will be impacted, impaired, or even eventually cut for some people, with most needing to pay to transition to a completely new system. And think, a commission of 3 people in some building in DC is pushing through this massive change, with Congress seeming oblivious. I mean, is anyone even paying attention? I mean, I'm asking seriously. Think about that. 3 individuals allowing a whole industry to basically start tearing up lines, and to do so without going through the safeguards that were put into law. So if you're looking at this from the outside, as most of us are, you see this and you're like, my goodness, they're removing all the stops. They're rushing, it seems. They're trying to meet some sort of deadline that we don't know about. And maybe they are. But let's get back to that term, grandfathering. If you have a copper line today and your exchange gets grandfathered tomorrow, your phone is still going to work, for now at least. The company still needs Section 214 authorization to actually discontinue the service completely. That requirement survived, but it's not really much of a help because when they approved the grandfathering process, they also removed any regulatory caps on pricing as well as the market dynamics that would keep prices affordable because there is no competition for a service that is being closed off completely to new customers. The phone companies are now free to push up the prices pretty much however much they want. And we already see the impact from those areas that have been grandfathered in for some time, with many of those phone bills experiencing double-digit percentage increases. Some businesses sticking with traditional service because they're grandfathered in have seen their monthly bill go over $1,000 a month. To put it plainly, the change is allowing phone companies to wage a war of attrition against those who choose to stay with the traditional plain old telephone system. You want to know how it works? In AT&T's second quarter earnings call in July 2026, the company said it expects a couple hundred of its wire centers to have 0 customers by the end of this year. 0. And some of that will be using the March 2026 FCC order to do it. So that's March. Now let me tell you about that building in Oklahoma. I would like to take a pause here to give a brief moment for another project I'm working on. It's a cartoon I call Gromley. And beyond the website where I post daily comic strips, I also produce funny shorts. Not the kind you wear, but the kind you watch. It's my way of bringing back the funny papers, back when most people actually read newspapers. I also think it complements this because, well, plain meaning to me is kind of like a newspaper. Well, at least a news website, anyway. So without further ado, here is a Gromley short.
Take 2 quarters. Spend a few hours in the arcade.
I can just go sit on a bench and play games on my phone.
Really? I get bored with my phone after a few minutes.
Pip, don't ask Frank for app recommendations.
Now, I hoped you laughed, or at least cracked a smile a little bit. I kind of chuckled. And if you want to see more, you could subscribe to my Gromley YouTube channel and also visit the Gromley website, gromley.com. Okay, let's get back to landlines. Farm country. In late January of 2026, AT&T's Senior Executive Vice President for Transformation and Global Supply Chain, Susan Johnson, appeared on a telecom industry podcast and mentioned almost in passing that the company had recently powered down its first wire center. She described what that meant in a way that sounded like it was a shopping list. The central office, the voice switch, the remote terminals, the copper lines themselves, those were all shut down. She framed it in a post on a social media site as a milestone. It's the first, but not the last, since AT&T is aiming to do the same in the remaining 4,600 wire centers. She didn't say which site was the first. That silence seems a bit odd, though, because, if you're going to call it a milestone, aren't you going to give the details? At least not one that seems to be accessible to the public. And that's because carriers are not required to file anything when they actually complete a shutdown. The regulatory system tracks authorization, but basically ignores the actual closure, it seems. The best you can do is narrow it down. And I did my best to do just that. The March order was not AT&T's first approval. Back in November of 2024, AT&T filed an application with the FCC covering 9 wire centers in Oklahoma. That application was approved on December 21st, 2024. And the FCC's public notice names the 9 towns: Bessie, Breckenridge, Kearney, Hillsdale, Hitchcock, Morrison, Quapaw, Rocky, and Tupelo, Oklahoma. The notice states that AT&T planned to discontinue the service on or about September 15th, 2025. Those 9 are the only AT&T wire centers anywhere in the country with an authorized discontinuance date in 2025, at least that I could find. So the first copper telephone exchange in America, at least under AT&T's watch, to go permanently dark was almost certainly one of those 9 rural Oklahoma towns. Physical decommissioning across roughly 500 wire centers started this June. The company's stated target is to be out of the large majority of its copper by the end of 2029. And it isn't just AT&T. Verizon has been retiring copper as well. Lumen, Frontier, and CenturyLink have all filed their own retirement notices, with most carriers targeting somewhere between now and 2029. So somewhere in Oklahoma was the first. It was done quietly in a rural area with no specifics. And the authorization to do it was done in December of 2024, during the holiday seasons and in between administrations. For something that's called a milestone, it definitely seems strange. But let's take a moment and actually go back and see what we're losing. Remind me what POTS is again? POTS stands for plain old telephone service. That's the actual industry term for it, believe me. It seems like it wouldn't be, but it is. I did a full episode going more in depth about it and the situation generally before the March FCC vote. I highly recommend you watch it, but after you finish this video, of course. The link to it will be in the description and in the comments for that video. So I'll just give a brief version here since the fuller one is a link away. Essentially, your phone connects over a pair of copper wires that runs from your house to a building called a wire center or central office. That pair is yours. You don't share it with anyone or have it associated with anyone else. It's physically and electrically yours. At the other end sits a switch and a bank of lead-acid batteries backed by a diesel generator. Your telephone is powered from that building. That's why the telephone worked when the lights went out. And when you make a call, that call is circuit switched. A path is set up, dedicated to you, and held for the duration of the conversation. It doesn't share any bandwidth with anything. Now, what do the phone companies want to replace it with? For AT&T, the flagship answer is a product called AT&T Phone Advanced. It's a small box about the size of a router that gets installed in your home. It's built on hardware from a company called Data Remote. Your existing telephone plugs into it, along with your fax machine or alarm panel if you have one. It produces a dial tone, and it delivers that dial tone over AT&T's wireless network, with broadband as a backup depending on the deployment. AT&T says you keep your number in your existing phones, and a 24-hour backup battery comes with it. That might seem nice, but in reality, you get to keep your advanced landline replacement for a day after the lights go out. But after that 24 hours, you're on your own. So let's hope you don't have a hurricane or a snowstorm come through that keeps the lights out longer than that. Oh, but it gets worse. When you read AT&T's own disclosure on the battery backup keeps the box alive, but it does not power the device connected to it. So you better get something else for your phone if you want that to work with the box. But I think they kind of need each other, don't they? And there's a second thing in the documentation worth knowing. You have to keep your registered address current with AT&T. Our 911 may be dispatched to the wrong location, and you may have to tell the operator where you are. With copper, your location was where the wire led to. It was dedicated to your place. So here's where I want to address a few comments I received on my last video. A number of viewers wrote in taking umbrage, I like that word, with my references to copper lines, since the copper doesn't usually make up the whole system like it did for most of the 20th century. And they're right. Starting in the 1980s, phone companies deployed something called a digital loop carrier. Instead of running 1,000 copper pairs all the way from the central office to a neighborhood, they put a cabinet out in the neighborhood, fed it with fiber, and ran copper only for the last stretch. It was cheaper. But I wasn't wrong, since there still is copper on the user's end and usually at the wire center end. But their point made me realize I needed to be a little bit more clear about what the difference actually is and not necessarily get hung up on the copper part. Although I still argue that keeping that copper is pretty important. So here it goes. Yes, a great deal of what we call the copper network has had fiber in the middle of it for about 40 years. But more importantly, that modification did not change the thing that actually matters the most. Whether it's copper end-to-end or copper for the last mile, the POTS network provides a dedicated line. The system replacing wire centers works on the opposite principle. Your voice becomes data packets, and those packets travel over a shared infrastructure alongside everybody else's. On a wireless replacement, every phone, every fixed wireless modem, and every one of those little gateway boxes within sight of the same cell tower is drawing from one limited pool of radio capacity. I pointed out how this type of system is a step down from POTS from both a security and safety perspective in my earlier video titled The End of Landlines. Again, the link is in the comments. So I encourage you to check out that video after this one to take a deeper dive. For this video on this point, the key to understand is this. POTS provides a dedicated line and the new stuff does not. Now, I would like to take one more brief moment for another project, Menu Escape. It's a listing for restaurants to have their menu items listed down to the item level, which means every item has its own page. This allows for easy sharing with others. And you or anyone that you know watching Plain Meaning, I'll offer you the listing of your restaurant or your friend's restaurant, the full menu, as well as a separate web page for each item for free. The only thing I ask is for feedback. On my end, I have been learning how to code and have a pretty good system for creating web pages now. It took me a long time. You got nothing to lose. You get some visibility on search engines, and for me, I get feedback to help me make Menu Escape better. So that's enough about Menu Escape. We still have landlines to talk about, don't we? An international mystery. After my last episode on this topic, I got a lot of comments and messages from viewers in the United Kingdom saying what I was talking about was happening to them right then. And so I did some digging. And what I found was actually quite interesting. Openreach, the infrastructure arm of what used to be British Telecommunications, stopped selling new copper phone lines nationally back in September 2023. The entire UK public switched telephone network is scheduled to shut off on January 31st, 2027. The Office of Communications, Ofcom, the British regulator, said it's final and it's happening. Millions of customers are being migrated to something BT calls digital voice, which runs over broadband. Now, that got me thinking, because the timing is very close, very, very close. Two countries, two entirely separate telecom industries, and two separate regulators. And yet, these two different countries are arriving at the same destination within about a year of each other. So I went looking for a business connection, some shared ownership, a joint venture, a common parent company between the British and American telecommunications companies. It's messy, and to be honest, I can't wade through it all. So if there is a connection there, I don't think I'm going to find it. But as I was researching this and looking into it, what I did find was actually quite interesting. Along the way through the various documents I was looking through, I found a quite ugly controversy in Britain about Chinese involvement in their telecom infrastructure. Huawei had been embedded in BT's network since the mid-2000s, supplying equipment across the core of British communications. And it took years of political fighting before the UK government finally ordered Huawei stripped out. That is a real story, and the concerns behind it were legitimate. I mean, allowing a foreign country access to the backbone of your national telephone system is a risk on so many levels, from business espionage to national security. But that doesn't seem to explain the similarities in the US and the UK timelines. It doesn't explain why an American carrier is turning off exchanges in Oklahoma. At least I haven't connected the dots, if there are any to connect. Well, I do want to mention one thing. It's more of a question to put out there and kind of a food for thought, maybe for later. Because something similar, when I was reading this about what was happening in Great Britain, I remembered something I was reading when I was researching that earlier video that was happening in America, and that was happening around the same time period. Actually, a little bit earlier than what happened in Great Britain, at least from what I could tell in the timelines. In Texas, around the time period where George W. Bush had already transitioned from governor of Texas to the president of the United States, under Rick Perry's governorship, you actually had an opening up of Texas's telecommunications industry. And a lot of that came from China. And from what I could tell and gather, a lot of the inject of Chinese telecom into America actually started around 2003, 2004 in Texas and then spread outward. And that deserves its own episode because there actually might be connections between the China problem in Great Britain and the China problem that was here in the United States. But that's for a different episode. And that will require a lot more research. So I just wanted to put that there on the horizon because it did cross my mind. But I'm not entirely convinced that that was what's pushing this movement off the old POTS system to this new system. Because it's not just Great Britain, but I'll get back to that in a minute. But I put aside the China issue and I kept digging. I wanted to find another reason, another rationale, something else I could put my hands on. And I found it. I came across an organization you probably never heard of. And to be honest, I never heard of it. But you're about to learn about it because it's been shaping every phone call you've ever made. The organization is called the International Telecommunication Union. The ITU is a United Nations specialized agency headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It's actually older than the UN, and it's older than the telephones for that matter. It dates to 1865, back when it was known as the International Telegraph Union. The organization has three main functions. It allocates radio spectrum internationally through a treaty instrument called the Radio Regulations. It publishes technical standards called recommendations, and it does development work in poor countries. And when I started reading its standards catalog, I had a moment of recognition because the phone network being demolished right now is pretty much an ITU creation, or at least a standardization of it. The way your analog voice gets turned into digital bits is based on ITU-T recommendation G, 711. The signaling system that sets up calls between switches, that thing is called the SS7 that tells one central office to ring a phone connected to another. That's the ITU's Q700 series. The ITU wrote the outlines of the network that's being taken apart. And then in the mid-2000s, an ITU study group produced something called the Next Generation Network Framework, also known as the Y.2000 series of recommendations. My goodness, it sounds so boring when they name stuff. It defined the architecture of an all-IP telephone network, the target that every incumbent carrier on Earth is now migrating to. So the ITU wrote the standards for the network being demolished, for the most part, and the standards for the network replacing it. But technically, the ITU doesn't have the authority to require any country to do anything. I mean, that's why they call them recommendations. And thus, their recommendations are voluntary. And its treaty powers over radio spectrum and not national infrastructure timetables. But that doesn't mean the ITU, or at least its members and industry lobbyists, aren't influencing across international boundaries. So let's take a look at some of the players within this international club that, we didn't know about until, I just told you. Every telephone company running plain old telephone systems bought its switching equipment from the same tiny handful of manufacturers. These were Lucent, Nortel, Siemens, and Ericsson. And those manufacturers themselves stopped existing. Lucent was absorbed into Alcatel-Lucent in 2006. And Alcatel-Lucent was swallowed by Nokia in 2016. Siemens handed its carrier business to Nokia in 2007. Nortel went bankrupt in 2009. It was carved up. with the division that built the DMS switch sold off to a company that has since been absorbed by another company. The others discontinued their legacy switching lines and ended support. And the vendors now are part of the push into the new system. For instance, Nokia sells a migration service that includes consulting, planning, and execution for moving subscribers off the old network. But there's probably something more to it. Regulatory imitation also plays a hand. Regulators like to watch each other constantly. In Europe, there's a body that's called an Electronics Communications Committee that made this type of transition part of its strategic plan going back to 2015. Ofcom, that British regulator, watches what the European regulator does. And the FCC watches everybody. Industry associations circulate the same playbooks. And also, industry insiders often populate the regulation bodies themselves. This is why we see so many FCC chair members flow in from industry and then go right back out. Political scientists have a name for this. It's called regulatory capture. What this means is basically you have the industry capturing the entity that's supposed to regulate it, which means, well, they're basically controlling it themselves. It's funny because, this stuff is talked about in political science classes and courses. Believe me, I've sat through so many of them. And it's been basically defanged. It's talked as if it's, all bland. But when you actually look down at it, it seems like corruption to me. It seems like a corruption of the system that's supposed to be in place to protect you, the consumer, as well as a citizen, from any abuses from giant entities. Not just the government, but also corporations. But instead of calling it corrupt practices, we call it regulatory capture. But there's more, because beyond the corporations pushing for control, the ITU has also become the venue for a serious fight over authoritarian government control and influence. Russia and China have pushed repeatedly to shift internet governance away from the multi-stakeholder model. This is where engineers and companies and civil society all have a seat at the table. But they want to move it toward a purely intergovernmental system where only national governments can vote. So to sum up, we have an international standards body that has been pushing for changes for over a decade. You add this along with the interests of the big telecommunications giants and the push by Russia and China, and you get a big mess without any clear answers. But it does give us some questions that should help put things plainly. Cui bono? Who benefits? So we have a lot of scattered pieces from our review. That gives us enough to start asking the important question of who actually benefits from this forced transition. Because this is forced. For one, it will be the companies who control the systems that are replacing the old ones. The last major wave of patents covering parts of the network we now call POTS came between 2002 and 2005. But these were not for the copper portions, which were already public domain, but rather on the IP layer that got grafted onto them. IMS, standardized by 3GPP, and ETSI are included in this. They basically brought digital to an analog system. Soft switch and back-to-back user agent architecture also were in this wave. Session border controllers, media gateway control, all kinds of new things grafted onto the tried and true POTS. Ericsson, Nokia, Lucent, Nortel, and Cisco held most of these patents. And a company called Acme Packet built an entire business on session border controller patents from these for years. So by the mid-2000s, you had a single hybrid network with two completely different ownership regimes running through it. The copper, the switches, SS7, and the codec were free because those patents expired years earlier. The digital stuff was patented and making a handful of companies lots of money. But with patents lasting 20 years, that area is entering the public domain now. The next big load of money is found in new technology with new patents that allow a new monopoly to form. There's only so much we can know for sure without someone just coming out and saying it, if this really is a patents thing. But history definitely shows that expiring patents have driven drastic changes to systems before. In my previous episode on the light bulb, that link is also in the comments. I looked at the huge changes to light bulb designs that were forced onto Americans by Congress, of all things, in 2007. Of course, it wasn't really Congress that was driving it, but rather the lobbyists who were pushing Congress to pass it. These changes allowed the makers of new light bulbs based on LED and halogen to become the dominant player because the old incandescent light bulb was made basically illegal. That old light bulb was public domain technology that anybody could manufacture. It was cheap, it was accessible, but the replacements were not, and they were proprietary. And we could even spot the pattern again if we look farther back in the history of the plain old telephone system, since the wave that preceded the early to mid 2000s wave happened just as the 20-year period that started with the previous era of patent technology was ending. Specifically, the major transition from electromechanical crossbar systems and early analog equipment to stored program electronic switching, which was ushered in by the introduction of AT&T's 1ESS in 1965 and the subsequent rapid patenting of computerized digital switching components throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. And those hit their patent deadlines in the early to mid 2000s. So there is a huge incentive for forcing new changes just as a technology that is dominant loses proprietary exclusivity. So that way a new era of control can start with new technologies. Because what is an active patent if not just basically a monopoly that's enforced by the government? Obviously, new technology can bring better capabilities, but when you see how a physical system built to be reliable and accessible being turned into something that can't even survive over 24 hours with electricity, then you start to see that newer doesn't always mean better. Far too often, new simply means new monopolies. Who doesn't benefit? So who doesn't benefit? First, rural Americans definitely lose out because they'll be losing the physical connections to them. They'll be at increased risk than those who get access to fiber line service. But even with fiber, it's not powered externally. So if the lights go out, again, you've got 24 hours. And everyone loses something big. And that's the security that came with having a physical system like what the POTS provides. It provides a redundant capability when the cell networks and other communication channels go down. But with the replacement taking the characteristics of cell phone networks, and in some instances actually using that infrastructure, you've got one system that could be overloaded. But beyond that, the POT system can be maintained and you've actually paid the fees and taxes that have covered those costs. Or was at least supposed to be covering those costs. In the early 1990s, states made a bargain with the phone companies. New Jersey's deal is the clearest, where in May 1993, the state's Board of Public Utilities granted Verizon's predecessor pricing flexibility and higher permitted earnings. In return, the company committed to deploy broadband across the entire state by the end of 2010. A number of other states followed suit after that. At the federal level, the Telecommunications Act was sold as something that would usher in the information superhighway in a way that provided the security that came with the plain old telephone system. America would be wired end to end, but it would be fiber doing the connecting. But that promise never came, nor did the promises at the state level. That 2010 deadline from the New Jersey deal, that passed. It lapsed. In March 2012, New Jersey's regulator issued an order to show cause, demanding the company explain why it shouldn't be found in breach. In 2014, the state just settled, replacing everywhere by 2010 with wherever enough customers ask. I don't know about you, but it seems to be a pattern with these big corporations. They have a law, but it's okay. It's more of a recommendation. Meanwhile, the regulatory model that could have caught this had been, dismantled. Under rate of return, a commission could examine whether money collected for maintenance was actually being spent on maintenance. Under the price caps that replaced it, deferring maintenance stopped being a violation. And so the telephones deferred maintenance more and more while spending more focus elsewhere. 30 years later, the same companies, or at least their new forms after the mergers and acquisitions, they explain that the copper is too degraded and too expensive to keep. But that's not true. If you run the numbers and look at the history, their maintenance deferrals have come due. And it's time to use the money they were given for the telephone system it was given for. So that's my update about the landline situation. Share, subscribe, and comment if you enjoyed this episode. Also, reach out to your congressman's office or your senator's office or anybody, really. And please comment and share, especially if you're getting letters from the companies about changes to your phone system. It'd be interesting to kind of have a conversation about this.